And on behalf of our director, Linda Cathcart, and our board of trustees, it's my very great pleasure to welcome you all here tonight. We have planned this roundtable discussion, or as someone called it yesterday to me, which I thought was very appropriate, our fireside chat, the CAM fireside chat, in conjunction with the current exhibition, which is on view all around us in our time, the history of Houston's Contemporary Arts Museum. The exhibition consists of works of art shown in various exhibitions here over the years, as well as related documents and other visual material. In Our Time is the result of a preliminary attempt to order the records of the museum, to organize them into a coherent and usable form. This process was not as easy in this institution as it might have been in another, because for many, many years the museum, or as it was first known, the Contemporary Arts Association, was run by dedicated and spirited volunteers, and their records were in their personal files as well as their memories. So as we began this preliminary process of ordering our records, it occurred to us that the material involved was so wonderful, so fascinating, and so valuable that an exhibition and publication which documented the history and celebrated the accomplishments of the museum would be most appropriate. And that was the genesis of the show that you see here around us. We began our research by contacting members of the community who'd been associated with the museum over the years. And while this was an enormously heartwarming task and we made many, many new friends, we became aware as our research progressed that our publication and our exhibition was obviously not the end of our task, but perhaps the beginning. And that we do look on it that way. And our discussion tonight is an attempt to gather further material and to understand better the spirit and the wonderful nature of all those people here in Houston who made the museum what it is. Tonight's discussion, as I say, has been planned to be both informal and informative, and we encourage you as members of our audience to contribute by comments, by suggestions, by answering questions, in whatever way. But we solicit your information and your comments along with that of our panel. Tonight, the panel has been chosen, of course, from among the many, many supporters of the museum over the years, and we know there are many, many more of you in the audience. We just couldn't have the whole audience be the panel. So we have a little informal division across this table, but we really encourage you to participate with us. It's my pleasure to introduce our moderator tonight, Ann Holmes, who is presently the Fine Arts Editor and Critic of the Arts at the Houston Chronicle, a position she's held since 1948, which was coincidentally the year the museum was founded. She was educated in Mississippi, here in Texas, and in Alabama. She studied drama, music, and art. Among her many awards and grants was one in 1953 from the Herald Tribune to study art and the practice of art in 13 European countries. In 1961, she had a John Simon Guggenheim Foundation grant to observe and study the arts in America. In 67-68, a Ford Foundation grant for observation of major theater directors at work. And during the 70s, she has 4 times been the recipient of the John G. Flowers Award for Architectural Criticism. So I will let Ann then introduce the other members of our panel, and please feel free to participate with us in our talk tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Marty. I thought that we might just introduce everybody and get everyone here to say a little something first, and then we will throw it out, and then it will probably just be knitted back and forth between us all. But that's the one way I think that we would ever get through hearing all of us, because I know all of you are very vocal and have lots of things to add to this. So let me first just go down the list. Here's Howard Barnstone, who needs no introduction, a well-known Houston architect, known nationally, who has been involved in a number of the exhibitions here. He's been a board member of this organization. Don Barthelme, behind the beard there, had an exhibition here in '54. He was the acting director in '61. He did several exhibitions here, some of them controversial, which we will explore later. Preston Bolton was here from the very beginning, and he staged several exhibitions here and served as president in 2 different times, and I believe chairman for some other years. Sissy Kempner is, of course, the current chairman of the board, and she's been a former president and has been long on the board. Baleen McCormick has been a stalwart. She's been a board officer, and she was a very extremely valuable and heroic person during the flood period. Ava-Jean Mears has been here from the beginning. Her photography proves that. In the catalog we have in the exhibition, we see credits for Ava-Jean Mears. And so she was the secretary, and it says 19 dash blank. We don't know what year you were the secretary.
50 through 52.
That was quite early on. And then she did a number of exhibitions, and I know that you and Herb were valuable in bringing together other exhibitions for that which we can talk about later. Mark Moldauer is, of course, known as a physician in the city, but he's also been a board member since the 60s and has done a number of exhibitions here. He's been very close to the organization in certain years, and among the shows that I particularly remember were his Romantic Agony, From Goya to DeKalb, which he did with Jerry McAgee. And there was the Rauschenberg show, which, and then the Merce Cunningham and John Cage evenings, which were never to be forgotten. Bob Wilson is a silent member over here. He's been a board member for a long time and has been involved in a number of exhibitions. He's, of course, known in Houston as a very successful architect, and his shows have included the John Marin, Mark Toby, and Morris Graves show about contemporary calligraphers, and there was a collage show that ranged from Picasso to the present, and the present at that time was 1958. Preston Fraser isn't here. He was to have been on with us. Carl Kamrath, I'm happy to say, is with us, and he is, of course, the designer of the original building and is well known as a Houston architect and a man of parts. So here is our group, and we'll just sort of throw around a few things. I'll just start out by saying that there was once a very young art critic who joined my staff, a young lady who is now long gone, who came to me one day and said, "It's marvelous. All these art galleries have opened just now that I have come to work." And it reminds me that we all sometimes get to thinking that the world began the day that we were born. Well, art didn't begin in 1948 in Houston when the Contemporary Arts Association, as it was then called, was formed. There were a lot of interesting things. Houston, had in 1901, if you can believe it, the Metropolitan Opera came to Houston to do Lohengrin. Would that they would come today to do Lohengrin. But that was 1901, and then they came back in 1905 and did Parsifal. I mean, and they will never give us any. We never get any of these things. So we had Pavlova in 1922, and we have had Caruso, and we had a lot of people in the earlier years in Houston, and so that obviously the arts didn't begin at any given time. But 1948 was actually, as we look back on it, we have the value of distance now to know what 1948 really stood for. At that time, the Museum of Fine Arts didn't have all of these lovely contemporary additions. It was that little classical revival building over there, which we can see part of on the South Garden, in the South Garden. It had no full-time director. James Chilman was there, and he was a very respectable, good man, but he was only part-time. The Alley had just been born the year before with a play called The Sound of Hunting in a little, just a little room at the back of an alleyway, and that we all thought that was the beginning of hotshot theater in Houston. But theater had existed before. The Little Theater had existed, and there were other theaters too. And of course, all the great troopers had come through here, Joe Jefferson and Maud Adams and many others. So that, again, nothing was really new. But still, in 1948, it was a turning point. The Houston Symphony, which had been born in 1913 and had gone along with a series of conductors, suddenly brought in Ephraim Kurtz, and the beginning of the modern Houston Symphony dates to 1948. So there was no Houston Grand Opera. There was no Houston Ballet. Ballet Russe was coming at those years. But when you think about it, the fact that there was the great need and concern and interest of the Houston people to start a contemporary museum in Houston when there wasn't even an opera company, which is the first kind of thing anyone thinks of in a conservative community, that they wanted a contemporary museum or a contemporary activity is marvelous. And they did, and they got it. And so they started it, and I think that in that kind of a context, it's interesting to go back now and see and talk to some of the people who were there. And so, Preston, why don't you tell us, you were there at the beginning, what was the atmosphere of who was involved, and what was the sense of things at that time?
Well, I think the sense was to find some place for contemporary art in Houston. Walter Farmer, of course, was the first guiding person. He was with Foley's. He came here with a new Foley's store, and before that, he'd had a record in the war of cataloging the German paintings that were found in the salt vaults and that kind of thing. He made him very interested in paintings and interested in bringing more to Houston, and he himself had a small but very fine collection of very contemporary German artists, and he began to try to find a place for these things to be seen or show them in Houston. And this was one of the reasons. I think it was a little selfish reason on most of the people who started it, in that they wanted more expression from their own interest and more way to find people who agreed with them in a contemporary movement, which at that time in Houston was not as prevalent as it might be. In architecture, it was much more prevalent. And Carl, who's here, certainly was one of the guiding lights in seeing that the contemporary architecture of the time was done and appreciated. But art was another story at the time.
Well, Abigine, you were there with your camera, poking into all the corners. Who were the personalities that actually got things going, and what was the first exhibition like? And
Well, the first exhibition that we had after I began to work there was the Bernard Leach. It was a ceramics exhibit. But the people that were involved, I understand that I'm supposed to speak for the Burlap Gang in the absence of Preston Frazier. Well, it sounds like the Gang of Four or something, I don't think it was ever very clearly defined, but I think that there was a lot of wonderful leadership on the part of members of the board at that time, and those were people like Nina Cullen and the Strausses, the Camras, the Freeds, people who had actually founded it. And then there was another group of people who, Preston Frazier, the Gadbois, Biddy and Frank Welch, the Gieslands, people who were very active in the exhibit, Preston Bolton.
why were you called Burlap?
Well, I think that all happened a little later when there began to be the struggle about which direction the museum was going to take.
You'll develop that.
And that's a little premature to talk about that now. But the atmosphere at that time that I recall, and of the people that I was associated with at that time, and most of them are still some of our very dearest friends, was one of such commitment and such excitement and such anticipation. You know, Houston at that time, you were talking about the things that they did, but I recall, I think in 1950, you had to go to New York City to get an English muffin. I mean, it was not sophisticated. And so, you know, it was really wonderful to have this thing that we could all just give ourselves to with such abandon, and that's what made it so exciting.
Well, now, at what point did the design in the home show come about?
That was earlier. I think that was one of the very first.
That was one of the very first shows. Now,
and that was, I think that was 49, 50.
Really close to tell about that now.
That was old hat.
Well, but it really did seem to affect an awful lot of young people who were just coming on as young urbanites, and they saw Noel, and didn't they? Tell about what was in that show, Howard.
Well, there are things that would seem a little old-fashioned now.
No, of course. We've got a lot to have.
Chairs
and Russell Wright china. I still have some. I was crazy about it. I went out and got some Russell Wright.
I wanted to ask Abigine, in those days, let's say from 48 until the onslaught of Dumeniles, what portion would you say was the CAA a gallery for its own members, for the artists who were basic founding members, and what portion of it, conceptually, was to show the work of others, say, modern work for people from, say, other cities or other art centers? How much was it a gallery just to show our own work?
Well, I think it was not that very much, by evidence of the fact there wasn't any there wasn't any individual's work shown. I mean, like whose work?
I'm just asking the question.
No, well, I was going to say,
right.
if you,
It didn't develop
it
that
did
way.
not
I remember
develop.
that
The Art
too.
League took care. The Art League was very active at that time, and the Art League took care of that particular aspect of the community. I mean, this was very definitely, I think, brought to show people in Houston things that they had never seen before. I mean, it was strictly a.
I remember
course
the
it
first
was-
show that we had at the Museum of Fine Arts, which was the opening show, really, of the organization. This was a carefully juried show with Russell Wright and the most contemporary things of the home. And we went in one day, and there in the middle was a piece of art that one of the local artists had brought in and just put in the show.
I think in later years, the artists really were furious about why the Contemporary Arts Museum was not more interested in the local artists, and we will get on to that point. But, Bob, what about, what are your recollections of your participation in
Well, my earliest recollection of the Contemporary Arts Museum was when I was asked to loan a Paul Maxwell to a show when Carl's building was still in the other location. That was my first recollection. And then it skips in between from there to just before Jerry McCaggy.
well, then, when what was your association with Jerry McAgee then? What things did you do?
Well, I think when Jerry arrived,
Came
we
much
had
later.
just finished the Marantobian Grave show. We needed a microphone. When Jerry arrived, we had just finished the Marantobian Grave show, which I suppose it was actually, she arrived before it was finished, but that was the time she arrived, and from then on, I was more or less involved with things that she was doing. But that show was, I think, I worked with Lorraine Gonzalez, who we all remember, and I can't really remember how the idea came about, except maybe I saw the calligraphy in three of these artists, and so it was related. A show that was related to Oriental calligraphy as seen in these three artists' paintings. I felt like I had really arrived when later on, after it was almost over, Dominique Demenil sent me a note complimenting me on the show.
Carl, I know you designed the building, but did you continue to have an input into the activity there? Were you ever involved in staging a show, or what was your ongoing interest in the CAA at that time?
Well, sure. I think I'm the only member here that's original charter member of the organization.
Maybe you are.
So we started it.
Okay.
There were 13 of us. And we met at Walter Farmer's house one night and decided that since what we call the big museum never contributed to showing of the contemporary arts, there was so much that was being done in the contemporary arts area. That's silver, that's jewelry, that's photography, that's architecture, that's furniture, that's textiles, and the whole works. And so we decided we would band together and form this organization, which we did that one night. And one of the interesting things that I feel about the organization, that all of us took a personal part in taking on a show, an exhibition. And, well, there's so many things that come to mind over the years, but in the early part, and the people who have talked before haven't really begun to touch on this yet. We felt a need for educational purposes, and for some several years we conducted educational classes for children free of charge. And I will say this, that we never put on any kind of an exhibition down there that was ever charged for, including the Picasso show, which we had them standing 3 blocks long all the way to Main Street to go in there, and this sort of thing. And
What year was that? The Picasso show.
was before you were born.
Oh, I wish that were true.
But we eventually got around to going through all of the various contemporary art areas. And one thing that we kind of bowed our necks on, that you think of contemporary art, you kind of think of it as a painting on the wall. This was verboten. No paintings, no anything. This is contemporary arts as such. Silver, ware, furniture, textiles, architecture, and this had never been brought to Houston before, and this is why we formed the group, because we couldn't get anything done across the street. And so the wonderful part about it was that each of us took on the job at putting on a show voluntarily. And I remember one night, Philip Johnson was in town. He was doing Dee Manil's house. The Dee Manils came in much later. They were not involved in the early setup of this thing, even a little bit. Anyway, it was the evening that, I was involved with, after about 2 or 3 years, they decided, well, Carl, we got to have a contemporary architectural show, and you're it. So I took on the job like everybody else did. And I was very fortunate to be out in Scottsdale on the way back from Oregon, where I was visiting critic at the University of Oregon for one semester. And I talked to Mr. Wright, Frank Lloyd Wright, out there. And he had been in our office in 1949 when he was here to receive the gold medal for the American Institute of Architects. Anne, you remember that?
I do.
And I was in charge of him, and Ms. Wright. And he came by the office one afternoon and spent the afternoon in the office. I don't know, Press, were you there then?
Yes.
Yeah. And yeah. And we had built a little model of my design for the contemporary arts, a little 30, and that's another story. I designed the building in one day. I started at 8 o'clock in the morning, finished at one Sunday morning and finished about 11:30 that night. This is plans, specifications, details, everything. Wasn't that simple a thing, but it fell together. I was looking at a 30-60 triangle, and I was trying to find a shape that was conducive to showing in 3 dimensions, and this sort of thing. And this did the job as far as I was concerned. Well, while I was there, stop me if I'm
You're
going
going to
too
have
long.
a limit because we've got a lot of people to talk tonight, so we're
Well,
going to stop you pretty soon.
All right.
But I want you to make your point.
Well, while Mr. Wright was in town, he was out at the office, and on the shelf alongside my desk, we had a little model built of this building. Mr. Wright went over and looked at it. He said, "Carl, what's this?" I said, "It's a little building we're going to build for the Contemporary Arts Association here and showing contemporary arts." So he picked it up and looked at it, put it down. Next thing I knew, he was doing the building at the Guggenheim, temporary building at the Guggenheim, which was shaped exactly like this. And I don't know if that had any influence on him or not.
But your building has certainly been a wonderful one. It was a wonderful one for the early years of this organization.
Well,
seemed,
it did a job that we needed to have done, and it did it, I think, in a way that a lot of people don't realize, probably until this day.
Well, it had a definitive shape. It was recognizable. It was down there in Midtown. I wish we had a museum downtown now. It
We were
moved in the middle of the
We
night.
were looking
and,
for somebody to give us a little site on Main Street, but we went up and down Main Street. We couldn't find any. You know, a vacant parking
Don't
lot. or
fuss. There
something.
you were in
4
Sam
blocks
Houston
off.
Park.
Yeah.
Preston, tell about the night that the museum moved. You were
Well,
there.
that was a wonderful, exciting night. I'll tell all I can remember.
That was like a lot of things that happened at the museum.
It was a beautiful night in that the city ordinance said that no building could start moving down Main Street until midnight. So everybody was all primed, and I do mean primed, by midnight. Into the symphony, and Mr. Olsham, who was much younger in those days, donated all of his services to moving the museum down Main Street. And he also had a flatbed truck behind for all the people who couldn't walk all the way down Main Street. So it was a glorious occasion as we went all the way down Main Street out to Prudential, and then had a big party at Prudential. So glorious time.
But Preston, we anticipated this. That's the reason we built the building in a triangle, the strongest shape you can have, so you can cut it in two and move it.
And that's what they did.
And then you added on to it later
That's
on,
right.
which was just fine. Well, at what point did the Demonils come in? Now, who can address this point? Did they not come in quite early with the Van Gogh show? Who was there at that point?
The Van Gogh show is the first identifiable thing, Howard, that I remember that they did. Did they do anything before that time?
No, but it was the furniture show that interested her, I think.
Which was prior to that, I think.
Right.
What would that show have been called, Howard?
The one you had asked me about.
About the contemporary design in
Right.
the home or something
Right.
of that kind, yeah. I wish I had total recall of those things, but we don't.
What would be interesting to know is whether, for instance, whether she went to Chilman, or whether they went to Chilman and were rebuffed, whether they ever tried to use the Museum of Fine Arts as a vehicle.
I don't really know that for honest truth, though I know that at the time that they came to the Contemporary Arts Museum, they were on the board of the Museum of Fine Arts, and I know that they were big supporters of the museum. The Van Gogh show definitely was the idea of John Demonil, and of course they paid for it all the way through.
What year?
Don't ask me that, Bob. I don't remember.
I'd say 52.
Yeah. Well, that was really quite a dramatic thing for Houston because we had some superb works here, did we not? La Berceuse and we had
And the
Dr.
point was it was a
Gachet.
free show.
It
No
was,
charge.
yeah, well,
charge.
the fact that we had those particularly great works here was marvelous. I believe, though, that when you come right down to it, it was not exactly what was in the minds of those original founders of this organization. That it seemed to be, he was not really the hard forward edge of contemporary art, certainly. He was a master of the modern movement, but not even that. I mean, he was expressionist who had belonged to another era. And if we were, it's my feeling that there were others in the organization who felt this is really not what we're driving at. That we were driving at theme shows, things that were in contemporary America. Does anybody have that same feeling that I have about that? I sense that, as I recall, that people said, well, that was magnificent, but really that's beside the point. We're not looking for big shows. Another show came along, Christian Berard. That was certainly inspired by the de Menils. We know of their early interest in him before they went on to far more sophisticated things. But there was resistance that I well remember to individual artists being shown. And I think that may have come from 2 or 3 different sources. Maybe from the fact that they didn't want sort of an establishment type, what shall I call the de Menil effort at that time? Not really establishment, but it was a kind of a bigger, more organized effort, as opposed to, or more even professional, as opposed to the kind of thing that the Contemporary Arts Association began as, with its interest in individual members exploring theme shows, and artists are bringing together ideas like calligraphy, for example, an idea and proving it with certain artists. Do any of you have any thoughts about that?
Well, there was an argument, of course, at the time because the one group felt that by showing things like Van Gogh and any of the big names that you were educating a public, and that education toward contemporary art was as important as showing what was being done in the current media. Because without knowing a little background of what they were seeing, people were not really appreciating the contemporary art of the moment. This was one of the feelings of the group.
Yeah. Just as Avogene said, we really were not very sophisticated in those years. We were fairly far removed, and it's hard to believe that just in 1948 we were as removed as we were from the centers of things, because there were obviously people among us who traveled, and there were people who were educated in the most far-out ways, but very few. And so that there was everything that we really did need to know. And I think that the wonderful thing is that everyone seemed, not everyone, but this particular everyone, seemed to know it. They wanted it. They were hungry for more information about everything. And anybody who traveled brought in news of this or that. And so it seemed to me that we were at a particularly precious moment of openness for all these things. Well, then came a moment of we had a growing conflict between the idea of whether to have a professional director or whether to have volunteers. And this has been part of the vitality, I think, really, of this organization. It's been part of the controversy, part of its great success. It surprises me how magnificent some of the exhibitions that we saw that were put together really by people whose calling was something else. So that, there were some good things, but at the same time there was the natural inclination to go toward a more professional institution. And so that when the moment came when McAgee was hired, she didn't really have an easy course. So that I don't really want to be the one to discuss this. I followed it in the paper, but some of you were there and were part
We were
of
there,
that.
Charlie.
So I really would like someone to address that point about the feeling that some of the volunteers may have had against the idea of a professional person in that role. Is there anybody at this panel, on this panel, who would talk about that? How about you, Bob?
I was for Jerry McKay.
Okay.
So you want somebody else?
What about you? You were for Jerry McKay.
I named the burlap group.
You named him. What do you think, Abigine? Are there?
Well, I don't think that anybody was resistant to the idea of having a professional director. I mean, because everyone began to see that it was going to be very difficult to sustain the kind of energy that you have when something first gets started. And plus the fact when you have volunteers, the good thing that can be said about it is that you're getting that person in the community who is best able to put on an exhibition. But the bad thing about it is that those people tend to make the same mistakes over and over again. I mean, if they had some continuity, just in terms of, by mistakes, I don't mean mistakes in judgment, artistic judgment, but just the sheer effort of trying to get these things together with a very small staff. I think that it made it very apparent that we were going to need some stronger professional leadership. I think the disagreement was whether or not that leadership should be artistic or whether that should be left to the board and to those people who were very capable of handling it, and then just have that person act as sort of not a business manager, but as sort of a general director rather than an artistic director. It kind of broke up too. I think that in any group that's passionate about the arts, I see it all the time. Now I work at the opera, and we have exactly the same thing. Any arts group, you have your missionaries and you have your theologians, and the missionaries want to spread the word. The theologian couldn't care less if a lady from Goose Creek comes in and says, "You have saved my life. I've never been so excited." But they are not only interested, but they are primarily interested in the advancement of the particular art form, of the approval of other people who have status in their minds in that particular field. And both of them are absolutely essential. I think anyone would be very short-sighted not to be very appreciative and very grateful for what the DeMonniers have brought to the city in many, many, many respects. I was thrilled by the Van Gogh show and the other things that they did too. But I think that what the burlap crowd, quote unquote, really had envisioned was a museum that was not only new in concept of what should be brought, but new in concept of how it should come about. I mean, a completely new concept of a museum. Not just subject matter, but on the whole way the thing would be organized, structured, and...
Now, Gene, isn't there also underlying in this discussion the remnants of the American handicraft movement stemming from Morris and all the people that just the very fact that Carl speaks of textiles and silver and all of these handmade objects, which continued through the beginning of the half century, and were being neglected by mechanical design and particularly European orientated Mies van der Rohe design or international school design. And within all of this discussion, that it was very much underlying a great deal of the controversy. That is the continued handicraft.
Feel that there was any kind of limitation in terms of what should or should not be considered appropriate subject matter or appropriate to be shown in the museum. What my feeling was that the squabble was all about how it was to be done. The artistic, I think the quality, no matter what it was very much in everyone's mind, but it was not so much that people disagreed so much about that. It was just that, as I said, there was some hope that there would be some completely new concept of what a museum was.
But you didn't think of an amateur museum, though, did you?
I don't think anybody wanted to be amateur.
I mean, that seemed
everybody got
questionable. Yeah, yeah.
There was another factor that didn't want professional leadership, and that, well, I'll use dear Mrs. Safford as a good example. She was the membership chairman for many years of the Contemporary Arts. And until I became president, she would not let a person become a member unless she knew them. So that had to change, obviously. Harriet says she knew a lot of people. Yes, she did.
Well, in order to get a commentary from all of us who are here at this moment, we'll sort of jump over things, and then we're going to go back to a couple of issues after everyone has spoken. I'd like to ask Don Barthelme to tell us the real inside story of the Ugly Show. No, he was. He's a writer who's seen some ugly things, I guess. But he did a show that was marvelous, and apparently the intent was totally misunderstood. But why don't you tell about it, Don?
Well, I think you have to understand a bit of the climate of that time. We're talking about 60, 61. Jerry McKeague had done marvelous shows for the museum. Then she went away. Then Robert Morris came in as director for 1 year. Then he went back to Yale, I believe, or New Haven. He was a Yale-trained artist and put on some very handsome shows. In 1961, the place was in ruins. Financially and ideologically in every other way. The reason I know it was in ruins is they would never have asked me to be director of the place had it not been in ruins. So this validates my statement. We had no money and very little direction. So we were running around saying, well, what the devil are we going to put on the walls? One of the things we decided to put on the walls was, for example, a show of Forrest Best's work. This came about because I said to Jim Love, what the hell are we going to put on the walls? And he said, well, let's go down to where Forrest lives, and I have a station wagon. And Jim and I went down to Forrest's place and loaded the thing up with about 60 small paintings and put them all on the walls. This is now seen as prescient. As genius, as being, remember this is 61, that's 21 years ago, whatever it is, well ahead of its time. That was Jim's idea, and we did it, but part of the dictates of the situation were no money and few ideas. On the other hand, we had occasionally we had some rather good ideas, which the board did not allow us to do. For example, I asked them to do a show of Joseph Albers, and in contrast to the other great teacher of the time, who was, quick Mark, who was he? Huh? Hoffman, yeah, a Hoffman-Albers show and their disciples. The board couldn't see this, and actually, had we been able to get it past the board, we probably couldn't have afforded it, because we were going on a kind of pay-as-you-go situation. The film series, which Henry Buckley was putting on, probably accounted for about 75% of our revenue at that time. We did the Ugly Show as the obverse of the good design shows which the museum, this museum, and the Museum of Modern Art had done historically. We thought it might be interesting to look at bad design. And of course, the culture plentifully supplies us with an example of this. And it was a really nasty, mean, ugly show. We showed hand grenades on pedestals and sort of thing, and ruffled some feathers, I suppose. There is no inside story. It was just that bad design was so wonderfully plentiful that it came across as a rather dynamic show. It's the underside of a good design show. Worth doing, I think.
But you know, after all, you were showing the bad register of reproductions of The Last Supper and of The American Flag.
Yes.
And because these things were in the show, the audience just, many people who came to the show said, "My gosh, the Contemporary Arts Museum says that the American flag is an ugly object, and the Last Supper." I mean, so the letters started pouring in, and all the complaints started coming in to not only the Contemporary Arts Museum, but to Prudential, on whose grounds this little perpetration was taking place. And so that there was I well remember the official letter from Mr. Fleetwood, which was just disgraceful. The whole thing was, this is a city growing up in art, It was a case of the great gap between the people understanding what he was doing, which was just a perfect explanation of how people can make things so ugly by mass reproduction and no faithfulness to the original. It was not what they thought it was at all, but totally misunderstood. And if I recall, it closed early. I know that it did.
No, I don't think it closed early. I think what did happen, we had to take the flag out.
What about the Last Supper?
We put a pair of breast knuckles in his place. Or a set. I don't know whether they call it a pair or a set.
But did you get any hard times from anybody? Did Mr.
No,
Fleetwood speak
the
to
board. Oh yes, we had difficulties with Prudential at that time, but the board was wonderful, and we had no trouble with the board. So
what would happen
Mr.
if
Fleetwood also got some letters at the time about the nude statue in his fountain out front. So
this was not part of that. I didn't believe.
What would happen if the ugly show were presented today, Don?
Well, you'd have a great time.
No, I think it wouldn't stir up anything.
No, not in the same way.
No.
They fall apart.
Yeah, what I think is that we were having the experience of the time, the great gap that existed because of where we were, who we were, and what year it was. And so that this is all history. Mark, you did the Romantic Agony exhibit with McAgee. How was McAgee to work with? I mean, how did that work out? How did you come together on that show, and what was your relationship as you worked together on that?
I arrived in Houston in late 57, by which time there were English muffins. But what the original Rudy's on Main Street chose to call Eggs Benedict was topped by hot mayonnaise and an olive. Jerry was like, Jerry then would have been like Longchamp, who stopped serving Eggs Benedict when they couldn't afford truffles. And Jerry, a remarkable experience for all of us who worked with Jerry. I don't know that I've ever spent as many consecutive hours talking to anybody as I did with Jerry before, during, after the Romantic Agony. And I don't recall, except for the invitation to do a show with Jerry. And there must have been 50 sessions that went on through a bottle of scotch and 10 hours about what would the show be. And I think I was probably reading Mario Praz's Romantic Agony, and that was the show. And we made enormous lists, and then enormous arguments about every painter on the list. Going back to the truffles, I think what was remarkable about Jerry was her capacity to go on with people who were not professionals, and at the same time direct them into a professional path. And the exhibits ended up always professional.
You felt that you contributed a great part to it, and that you were happy with your contribution to it.
Well, I wasn't exactly an amateur. I had come to Houston from very close association with the Hasty Group, the Cedar Bar in New York.
Yes, you have.
And if I can digress, I was thinking this morning a really funny story about when I first came to Houston. I thought, well, I don't know whether this is going to be a dreary or an interesting art scene. I think there had been several articles in Life magazine on exhibits in Houston. This would have been 57. When I got here, I went to the Contemporary, which had Jerry's beautiful Rothko show. And I think I met Jerry that day. I think about maybe 3 weeks later at Winifred Safford's at a dinner party, I first met Miss Irma Hogg. And I said to Miss Hogg that I really was pretty disappointed because I had thought there was an awful lot of contemporary painting, interest in contemporary painting in Houston. And Miss Hogg very lovely looked at me and said, "You've been here a long time." And I'm sure I blushed or flushed or squirmed and said, "No, no." And she said, "You've looked very carefully," and got up and walked away. And, but I think I was right. I think not long after that, I think it became clear that there were darn few pictures here. Darn few people who were very interested in then immediately contemporary art. But again, going back to Jerry, I think Jerry was interested in quality. And was interested in this, not interested in showing amateur work, particularly without an historic setting that would have improved the quality of local artists. Jerry certainly was interested in local artists. So much for my thought about the burlap group.
Okay. On this end of the table, Baleen, you were here during the time of the flood, and
you're skipping
I'm
quite a few years.
Skipping a lot. I had said I'm going to be skipping around because there are 2 or 3 issues I'd like to come back to that we throw open to everybody. So while we've got you all here, if you will talk a little bit about what the flood was, what it meant, what the problems were, and what had to be done. So just so for the record, some of us know those things, but you were so close to it. And what was the first you heard of it, and what did you have to do about it?
Well, I was president, and I had been down here all afternoon that afternoon, June 13th, 1976. And it was sort of threatening weather. We always were, Marilyn and I spent most of our days down here because the museum was again in very bad trouble financially. There was a lot of talk about selling the building and moving and using other spaces downtown and all kinds of things. And it was a very bad time. And so I went home, and Margaret Prince called me at about 4 o'clock and said, "The museum is underwater." And I said, "Oh, come on," because it hadn't even rained where I live. And she said, "No, there's 8 feet of water downstairs, and everything is ruined, and everything's floating around." And it was true. It was just the most horrible thing you could possibly imagine. The next morning, the water had gone down, had been pumped out by the fire department. And we just, Sissy and I were wandering around in our galoshes. Right. I still have the dress I had on because I could never throw it away. It was such a traumatic time. And the show up here was a video show that just opened and that hadn't worked particularly well. And everything was wet, everything, upstairs, downstairs. It was just horrible. And so we shut the museum for a year after that and tried to regroup. The good thing about the flood is that it made the board have a purpose, and it taught us also, all of us, how to fundraise, which was desperately needed. Before then, we'd kind of, I don't know, Marilyn had done most of it with Jim Harithus. And after the flood, we all really went to work. And those of us, like me, who said they weren't fundraisers, became fundraisers. And so I think in the long run, you know, since we survived, the thing that always has happened here, and which these people have been talking about, is that there's always been a passionate commitment of the certain people, not the whole board by any means, but always some people have just done anything for this place. And this has continued, and this is what has made the thing survive, somehow.
But so now it's in very good shape. I would really like to come to you at the end, Sissy, if I might, and get on to some other things now. There are 2 or 3 things that seem questionable in my mind as I go over the history of the organization, and I go back to where Jerry McAgee was let go for lack of funds. And I really wonder, and I would really ask anybody in this room to address the point if they would, what their feeling is, or if they have any knowledge of any groups who've had these feelings, that really it was not so much for lack of funds as that there was this same tension at that time that has always been in the earlier years of the history, that people really did not want that much of a professional director, and that they really did want to have more power in the decision making about the shows, and also in the actual staging of the exhibitions. I put this question to you. Anybody on this panel or anyone in the room, I would love to hear speak about it. There's another possibility. Is there a possibility that because Jerry McAgee was, in a sense, backed by the Demonils, that there might have been, despite their wonderful generosity, their knowledge and all, that there might have been a sense of reaction against their authority, their very authority, and perhaps their very force of their authority. Could these things have been what really caused Jerry McAgee to leave the museum? I think these things are moved over very fast in any history, and I would like to see that opened up.
I'll try. And I'm probably wrong, but my recollection is that when Jerry's reappointment at the Contemporary Museum came up for consideration, there were all the factors you mentioned. But I believe that the Demonils did not promote Jerry's reappointment simply because at that time the Museum of Fine Arts did not have a director. And the hope was that Jerry would become the director of the Museum of Fine Arts. And the whole politics misfired. Am I wrong?
Mark, you're right.
Yes, you are.
I didn't hear you, Elsie.
We can't hear you.
Oh, well, the whole thing again? I'm sorry.
I guess that under that arch they can't hear.
I was saying that when Jerry's reappointment to the Contemporary directorship came up, that was more or less let lapse, I believe, in part by the Demonils, and because of her close affiliation by many of the board at that time, who would have been quite happy to not have Jerry a professional as a director. And the reason for the Demonils letting that lapse was the opening at the Museum of Fine Arts, where the hope was she would then be. And that misfired.
History tells us that didn't happen, doesn't it, as you say. So I think this, too, we don't know what would have happened, but the very fact that Jerry was no longer with the Contemporary Arts Museum and that she then became available for St. Thomas was certainly a very interesting development in the community, and without that actual turn of events, we probably would never have the Demonil Museum, which we're going to have. I mean, as you look back, these interesting turns in the road are clear to us, but we don't know as we go along.
It could easily also be that the Demonil collection might have gone to the Museum of Fine Arts had Jerry gotten the directorship.
That's true. All these ifs. Well, I would love to hear from someone in the please.
All of us wanted total professionalism in the museum. I don't think there was any remnant of the board who did not want total professionalism. I think what happened at that period was the period that Mark was just talking about when Jerry's contract was not renewed.
Yes, okay.
I think it was because the board had no control over how the funds came or went. The funds were primarily through the generosity of the Demonils. The funds were at the total disposal of Jerry. We could not pay to clean the museum. We could not pay to fix the air conditioning. We could not pay to do anything that didn't involve the actual exhibitions. We could not afford to have a museum going on where we couldn't do the nitty-gritty. We couldn't pay the guards, we couldn't pay anybody because the Damanil money was earmarked specifically for salary and exhibitions. And I think
Was there no other money?
the other money was very much more minor. Very much more minor. The other money was not to the same extent.
Any other comments about that or any other thing? This is really a round table. The point is for everyone to give their recollections or to ask questions about things or make comments. What about Dorothy? Good. Do you have any feeling about the museum having a lack of interest in Houston or regional artists?
And what time of the museum?
Well,
When?
I'm asking you if you have any thought, I'm trying to particularly, if you have any belief about it at any particular period. You think that they were...
Well, I think that the time has come in Houston when it's on the verge of becoming a great city, as Washington has been at one time, where you go into the museum and you'd see catalogs, you'd see things that showed great evidence at the Corcoran that things were happening and that the artists were very much a part of the culture. I mean, they were it, in other words. They were making the culture there in Washington, which I think we haven't come to that point
You
yet.
feel that the Contemporary Arts Museum has been lax?
No, I don't say anything like that. I just say it's a growth of a city. That's all.
It's a city point of view that you're saying.
Well, a development of a culture. That's
When did fundraising begin for the museum? And it seems that there was none ever. Were you the first?
Not really good fundraising until the flood.
That's right.
It was not organized. It was always one person backing what they wanted to back. And that was the main problem down here.
Unfortunate
I just
situation.
have total recollection of when the budget went from $8,000 a year to $12,000 a year, and everybody thought, oh, how are we ever going to get $12,000?
Sissy, tell about how things are now. I mean, in this last year or two, that the Contemporary Arts Museum in Houston in this year.
Besides fabulous. Other than that.
Fabulous, okay.
Well, as Bylene says, it was the flood that really made us look at our fundraising techniques and really how much money we needed to operate for a year. Before that, I don't think we had an idea.
Yeah,
It
it
was
was
one show to the next show. Can we make the payroll this week? Can we make it this month? It was just unbelievable. We'd all assemble, and how are we going to pay them?
What amount of money did you say that you remember?
Went from $8,000 to $12,000.
What is the budget now?
Well, let's see. The 82, 83 will be $925,000.
Nearly $1 million. Okay, that's
far
not so
cry.
bad, is it?
Far cry.
But now, what about response? I mean, did you have a good turnout for your exhibitions?
Well, last year we had 100,000 people through this building. I think that's a doubling in just 1 year's time.
Double the attendance in a year's time. And the budget has jumped from what to what in a year or so?
Well, in a year or so, not that dramatic. I would say over the last, 5 years, it's doubled.
Doubled in 5 years, and attendance doubled in a year.
Yeah.
And what about the exhibition schedule?
The exhibition schedule, well, Linda needs to get up here, but it's 6 major shows in this
room.
In this room, we under Linda's direction, the museum is never closed. There's always an exhibition on, either in this space or in the Perspectives Gallery.
That's really great that they are so that they jog. That one goes to go always to see something. Well, it seems to me that the board and the professionals at this point are getting along in a lovely way. That there is this nice knitting together now of the professional staff with the invaluable people from the community, the volunteer people who make the museum go, raising the money, giving the support, stimulating interest in it. And this hasn't always been the case. So it strikes me that we may have come together with a very nice melding of things. Is there anything we haven't touched on that's on anybody's mind? The purpose of this night is really to gather together as much of the record as we can for the organization's history. And anybody who has any little jot of a recollection that would be colorful, an anecdote or anything, would be very welcome.
I have two things. In reading the Inalexandria catalog, which the museum has just put together, there's I got the feeling, and it has been brought up by the board, or by the panel, that there was a very definite feeling for crafts rather than art in the beginning. And some have denied it, some have, and it's not true. It seems to me that I'm getting a feeling tonight, and I started getting the feeling from reading the catalog, that the museum has been more of an association than a museum most of its life. And I came to Houston about the same time that actually the present direction of the museum came, a little before, but it seems to me that the museum has completely, it's remarkable what has happened in the museum in the last 3 years as opposed to what happened over 25 years or whatever. And I didn't realize this before. I came to Houston, and the museum I assumed had been a contemporary arts museum operating with a budget, with the board, etc. As a museum, I assumed that it was a much more established museum somehow, because I have only seen it as a very effective museum. And this seems to me now that this has happened in a very brief time, very recently.
Well, would you say, Aberdeen, that the burlap crowd represented a group of people who were interested more in crafts than in art?
Oh, I don't think so at all. No.
Does anyone think that there was a craft idea?
You said something also about you didn't want paintings, you didn't want a painting on the wall, you wanted crafts, silver, etc. So, which can be art. But did you assume that paintings done at that time were not yet? That you thought of paintings of Van Gogh's time and paintings now were not art, or other things were art in addition to painting, and that was something new?
There's a lot of art except painting.
Yes.
There's a lot of art except painting. There's a textile art that's probably more important than painting. There's furniture, there's silverware, there's you name it. There's this sort of thing, and we were trying to get away from the idea that art was a painting on the wall. That's just one phase of it. It might be architecture. Who knows? If you understand architecture, you know what I mean.
Like the emphasis on design that we see so often in the Museum of Modern Art, it's design, and as art is reflected in various other aspects of human activity. So I guess that's really what.
Well, there's one thing about the idea of a museum. I've always assumed, I guess I came on the board in '73, but I was familiar with the museum long before that. But I had always assumed that we weren't called a museum until we were in this building. But I was over at Dorothy Hood's one day looking through her scrapbooks, and so many of the auctions that I went to, but that the CAA used to have, Betty Ewing talked about the CAM. There was always the idea of the Contemporary Arts Museum, not just the Contemporary Arts Association. And I was fascinated to read that.
And I think we completely missed one disaster that had more effect on the museum than anything I know.
I know it.
That was the opening show of this museum.
I was hoping someone would generate that, but I'm glad you did.
But with that, you've also missed how was the building funded?
Yeah,
speak.
That's right, okay. Okay, well, let's talk about the funding first and then talk about the show that opened in. Okay, how was it funded? Who knows?
This building?
Yes.
Well, there again, it was a fund drive that did it. Carrington Weems was generally responsible for pulling this whole thing together. And one of the largest donors at the time was Pierre Schlumberger, who gave considerable money to buy the property that this is on and to start the building. Then some very generous corporate gifts filled out the rest of the lot for this particular building.
Well, in any case, then the show opened. Penn opened the show, opened the museum. Does anybody remember the press that was generated by that?
Everybody remembers. Look at their faces.
Well, that's the point.
Okay, who will tell what Penn was and what they felt about it? Is anyone who was close to it at that time? How about you, Baleen?
No, I think the audience remembers it.
The
Let
audience
somebody in the
remembers.
audience talk about it.
I wish someone would.
I frankly feel that Lefty at the time did what he thought was right. Now, later it may have not proved right, but he did what he thought was right in getting artists of the day to present something original. He didn't finish it, and I feel the artists let him down somewhat. I feel they did not produce for him what he hoped they would for this particular show.
But I really thought he was right in giving us the very hard forward edge of what was going on in certain areas of contemporary art. And even the cockroaches and all the rest didn't really bother me. I mean, if we're going to capture the sun in a little hole somewhere, and if we're going to see constellations, and if we're going to capture rain, and we're going to get the solar effects and so forth as art, which I honestly believe we should, I see all of those relationships in nature. I see nothing in the world wrong with asking that we think about their relationships in nature as far as animals and insects and growing vegetables are concerned. That really didn't bother me at all. But it absolutely flipped a lot of people. Well, I think that you have a very good point. The question would be then, suppose we hadn't opened this museum with that. What would happen if we had opened with something fairly accessible or tame, like as somebody suggested earlier, Liechtenstein or something like that, and had come along later with this exhibition? How would that have gone down?
Well, and can I say something? Remember, the wave didn't work. The plants were dead. The roach cages were filthy. That was the main problem. This city would have accepted it if it had been professionally presented.
I wonder if they would have anyway, though, Baleen. I think there was a great...
We would have had a heck of a better argument.
Yes, you would have, right.
I can tell you something here, but I'm afraid.
I think the idea is that you want a museum to be essentially a living organism. At least that's what we want this museum to be, rather. Very specifically, this museum, and not something that is the idea of a dead museum, something that's already happened, something that's already been. I'm not... I don't want to accept the fact of the 10 show having failed. It spurned a lot of energy, a lot of things, ideas, and thoughts about what this museum might represent to the community who would share in a different enthusiasm and in a different new museum than you people had the opportunity of doing.
I personally love the fact that it was that far out, and that it really did give us new ideas, and I was really, like everyone else, extremely disappointed in the fact that Grosvenor's piece was really not better than it was, and that Vera Simons, who is a very good artist, really failed with it. I mean, these were people well chosen. They were not just picked out of nowhere. It was disappointing, but at the same time, I really liked the idea that the museum tried. I mean, in all art history, the things we remember the best are like 1913 and Sacre de Printemps and a few things like this. This was not anything like in that it was not successful as that finally turned out to be, but it was certainly an interesting moment in the museum's life.
but it did smell bad.
Yeah, it did. It really did.
Interestingly, the same exhibit or same type of ecologic animal using exhibit had been done the year before at the Lido at the Biennale, and it was marvelous.
Yes,
it was outside.
it's an idea that really is interesting.
I think one of the things that shocked me most about that exhibit, because that was the year I came.
Was what?
That was the year I came, and one of the things that shocked me most about that exhibit was that it seemed to me, I hadn't realized that this kind of shock art hadn't entered Houston. And it shocked me to see people that were shocked.
Well, essentially the same thing, but even for a longer period of time. I've never with the Contemporary Arts Museum, except somehow every once in a while, there something that was creeped in, but that was so rare. It was always the leading edge. It was always professionally done. Someone said, well, it always looks so professional, that it'd be so cheap. Well, I don't know what magic was used, but it always looked great. And it was super theater. And it was the leading edge. And certainly down here, and very quickly down here. And I thought the tin show was super, even though it did smell and fell apart and all that.
Can anybody remember, is there a relationship between the vitality of the director and the program of the Museum of Fine Arts and our own vitality and program that is a sort of seesaw relationship? Or does it move together? Or is there any traceable pattern of relationship?
Well, we know that there has been not very good relationship from time to time.
Well, I'm not talking about personal relationship.
Well, I mean that there were times when really things were quite poor between across the street, and then I think the flood helped.
Oh, no, I didn't mean that at all. I meant in periods of great activity across the street, like when Sweeney was at his top.
What did it do to...
What did it do here?
That's a good question.
Or when Jerry was at her top here, what did it do there?
How did it influence them? Yeah. Okay, well that's... who would like to discuss that? It seems to me that now Sweeney was here at the Museum of Fine Arts between 1961 and 1966. And what was happening here in those years? I can't remember, have total recall. But it seems to me, I remember, that was one of the times that the question came up, do we really need a contemporary arts museum?
Yes.
Because that has come up from time to time. And
we did the Bacon Show.
Yes. But
Which
that,
certainly is on a good level with the museum.
Terrific. And do you remember Sweeney coming to that or saying anything about that? Because I think he would have been in favor of it. He wouldn't.
I don't think I've seen a single lace show at the museum since we opened. There were a lot before.
I often heard that it was part of the original intent that the Museum of Fine Arts would purchase out of this exhibition, out of these exhibitions. And I'd like to know from the people who were part of the association from the beginning if that was something that you intended or hoped for, and how do you feel about the fact that actually it's quite rarely been done. It's probably been done more in the last 5 years than before. But I'm curious about how the original people felt about that which I have heard. Did you hope that there would be purchasing out of these exhibitions, out of your exhibitions for the museum's collection?
I never heard of that as an official thing. Preston, you were in a position of authority in those years. What did you have any understanding that there was to have been this purchase from the MFA?
Well, the main agreement that I remember between the MFA was that when Nina Cullen gave her wing, in her deed to the museum, it says that the Contemporary Arts can use that space so many times a year, and I think it was 2 or 3, I forget. And that is still in existence if we want to use it, but try. So there definitely was an effort, and I think more so on the part of the museum boards to join together than the museum staffs. I've always felt that the staffs were where the problem came in not getting along with one another, never in the boards.
Well, now, there was a little plan in one of these little imaginary things downstairs by which this museum would be built in a certain shape, and Ian Glennie's plan, and the Museum of Fine Arts would acquire certain things at a certain period of time, which was amusing. But how often has the Museum of Fine Arts actually acquired anything? Is there any knowledge of that in this room?
Since Ann Tucker came to the Museum of Fine Arts, it's acquired a number of things, and I think that there are two people who have made that bridge. CAM trustee and who's led the way, and one is the other is Ann Tucker on their staff, and I think he brought the John Baldassari photograph out of the narrative show was maybe one of the first, and then since then many other things, and a number of our trustees have contributed to the acquisition of several major sculptures, including the Chuck Arnoldi, which will go on display next month. So I think Ann's question, also she deserves some credit for having made it happen if it was intended.
But really, it was out of hearing it. And I have been told that was the intention, that you all would sort of do the contemporary shows. We weren't really going to do contemporary shows. You all were doing contemporary shows. And we would look and learn and purchase. And I'm just curious if that was part of your thinking from the beginning. Early on.
In connection with that.
No, I never heard that.
In connection with that, was there ever any intention on the part of the Contemporary Arts Museum to have a permanent collection?
Yes. Yes, there was.
We were talking that around all morning.
Yes,
Have a collection, you know.
And something
was
later sold because we didn't sell it, but some things were definitely given.
Well, there was that Van Gogh, the reader.
Yes.
And some Calders and other things.
Lipschitz.
Yes. It really is too bad. I mean, they had to be deaccessioned, and there is no collection. In fact, that brings us to the point that there are contemporary arts museums are of different kinds. I mean, you can say that there is a modern museum, and you can say there's a contemporary museum, and you can say there's a collecting one and a non-collecting one. So what we have is not a modern museum, I gather, but a contemporary non-collecting museum. Is that right?
So far.
Okay.
When was that decision definitely made?
It hasn't ever been made. It's just made. I mean,
Just what it happens to be now?
we have no place to put it. We have no staff to maintain it.
We're dealing with the physical fact of this building, too. There's
At the time that the collection was started, it was done primarily because it was very difficult to borrow from other museums when you had nothing to lend them. And if you had things that they could borrow, you could get their things much easier. And this was one of the reasons for going into a permanent collection.
Clearly, when you built this building, you made a decision not to collect. Did that come up?
That was decided
That was
earlier.
decided.
Yes, it
Before
was.
this
Not
building,
earlier.
that was decided.
In fact, given this building, is it too touchy a subject to say, how do you like the building?
What's funny in reference to that question of collection?
Well, aside even from that, how does it serve the purpose of the present activity?
Ask Linda and Marty.
They're the ones that opted.
You guys right now.
What?
Yay or nay?
Does it look?
Imaginary show downstairs about, given the opportunity to design for the future for this building, what would you do? It just struck me that maybe there were things about this building that were, in fact, complicated to work with.
Now, the motivation for that show was that Houston is a city of the future, and that we were doing a show about the past, which was rather self-congratulatory in many ways. And we felt that rather than close off the history of the museum, rather than say, we look what's been done and accomplished, and end it there, that we thought that we could take the resources here, and one of the most valuable resources
next to the artists is the architects in this community, and say, you guys tell us what your fantasies are, and we'll have that as a catapult into the future. It was no more than that. I think it's been wished that it were something. We did bring Mrs. Brown to see it, but it was no.
In 20 years, will we be looking at a building that's the same shape? I mean, given Houston's ability to move as fast as it does?
We're laughing because, Eileen and I are laughing because we spent this morning in the Long Range Planning Committee meeting at which we're looking at 5 years down the road and trying to develop a plan for what we think Houston needs and what we can provide, and we polled our board for suggestions. We will be.
Where will we be? Can you tell us what you're thinking?
The process. The fascinating thing to me this morning was that we, as I say, we did poll our board, and that there was such unanimity, if you will, within the board and the staff about what we do well right now. Now, there was less unanimity about what we'd like to see done and how we'd like to implement those things. We want to supplement that before we set any of these ideas. We want to supplement those suggestions with suggestions from the community at large. We're interested in the future of this institution.
Well, how will it work in with the Museum of Fine Arts? I mean, what will be the future relationship with the Museum of Fine Arts, in your opinion, at this point?
It's tough.
We didn't really address that, though there were some interesting comments from various trustees about addressing the idea of collecting, the idea that that there could be a fund set up that purchased works from shows here that were destined to go across the street. And that seemed like an idea worth pursuing. That's one of many. I mean, I would be premature in saying, well, we decided X, Y, and Z, because we're very definitely in the process.
But the relationship is very good between the two museums at this time.
And some of us have forgotten that in the way back in the constitution of this organization, when we did have a collection, when we had Joseph Cornell, when we had Van Gogh, when we had John Lewis, when we had on and on and
Yes,
on.
wonderful.
Max Ernst, and multiply the amount of money that we today, that if the museum fell apart and could not survive, that its collection would go to the Museum of Fine Arts, and I think we will find that written in Gordon many years ago.
It's in the bylaw.
Bylaw.
On the fee, yes.
Well, meanwhile, for one reason or another, the collection was dissipated to survive, and now there isn't.
Well, there wasn't much I mean, there were very good things in the collection, but there were about 7 items. There really wasn't a huge collection.
Now, there were big, but there were, I think, about
40 works? 40 maybe, but only about 5 that were of the quality you're talking about.
There were 2 cauldrons, there were 2 chocolate chips, there's the Joseph Cornell, there was a Preston, what else?
We are talking about paintings.
There was a Van Gogh.
Sculptures.
There were a number of drawings and things of that nature, which I'm sure today would be far more valuable than they were at the time. I think some of those were ruined in the flood, as a matter of fact.
But the point is, there wasn't much left.
No, that wasn't here. That was sent away for auction.
Some of the things were auctioned.
Is any other comments? Well, I think we've had a wonderful discussion. I think what we have seen is a wild ride. The museum has been on a roller coaster from the beginning. We've had some great ups and downs, and I think perhaps since we have gathered here to just look at it, we have perhaps seen a more dramatic one than many other arts organizations have. although probably if the opera got together and did this thing, we might find similar type debacles and triumphs and so forth. But it's been a very successful history, 34 years, and now the Contemporary Arts Museum of Houston is one of a very small handful of important contemporary separate museums, and I think that Houston is extremely lucky to have the going thing that it does right now with the staff it has and the board it has and the public support. We're very lucky to have it. And I think it's great that everybody here has the kind of interest that they have shown tonight by being here and contributing to it. Thanks all of you for coming.